Hi everyone, welcome back to my channel. My name is Gretchen and today I am here with another Booker Prize Longlist review, and today's title is The Land in Winter by Andrew Miller. And also this is the last of the shortlisted titles that I have to complete a review for. Andrew Miller is no stranger to the Booker Prize shortlist. He was also shortlisted back in 2001 for a book called Oxygen. It's not a book that I have read. As a matter of fact, I have not read any Andrew Miller books beside this one. It does look like he has a pretty extensive backlist, and I did enjoy my experience with this book, so I am hoping to visit some of his backlisted titles in the future. So the first thing I will say about this book is I went into it pretty blind. I didn't read anything about the description or any of the blurbs. What I knew about the book I got from whenever they made the shortlist announcement, or I'm sorry, the long list announcement, whenever they were talking, you know, very briefly in kind of high level about what the books were about. So I knew that it was about two married couples. I knew it took place in winter. So I was a little surprised when I got into the book and the first chapter was about a man in an asylum. For a second, I honestly thought that I had picked up the wrong book, or that I was completely mistaken about what I thought that the book was about. But after that first chapter and we got through the narrative about the man in the asylum and an event that occurred in it, we did get into the story that I was more familiar with, and we do eventually circle back, and that whole chapter at the beginning does eventually make sense and tie in to the story. The rest of the book is set in a harsh winter that takes place between 1962 and 63, and it follows two young married couples that are living in a small English village and their neighbors. First we have Eric and Irene, and Eric is one of the small village's doctors, and he has a wife, Irene, and Irene is pregnant and she stays at home. She had a much busier life prior to them moving to this small village from the city, and Irene is kind of dealing with that loneliness and that isolation, and she is very much out of her element in her new surroundings. Eric, on the other hand, is dealing with his locale change in a very different way, and I'm not going to spoil what he is getting into or what he is up to, but whatever is going on does lead to tension and distress within their marriage. The other couple is Rita and Bill, and they are also expecting a baby. Bill is a farmer. He is a small dairy farmer, and we learn that Rita has a little bit of a wild past. She used to work at a club, and it's something that brings Bill a lot of shame, and he really wrestles to come to terms with the fact that the woman that he loves used to, you know, kind of have this secret life, and he really doesn't want to broadcast it anywhere or for many people to know about it. However, it doesn't bring Rita any shame. In fact, she still seems to be kind of drawn to that life, and she's very much nostalgic for her past, and she, like Irene, is also longing for some excitement in her life, and this kind of struggle that they're having also leads to some tension within Bill and Rita's marriage as well. So we have these two men that are totally caught up in how busy their lives are and whatever else they're getting up to. And one day the wives happen to meet each other and they immediately form a bond. They come from different backgrounds, but they share a common ground, not only because they are pregnant, but because they both have that sense of longing and loneliness and those feelings of isolation. And the friendship that they develop really brings a lot of meaning into their lives when they are really in need of it. So as their relationship develops and the men go about their lives, the story continues and we learn more about each of their lives, the wives and the husbands, and secrets start to come out and both of their marriages are tested to the limits. And we are also introduced to some additional characters and we learn even more about not only these characters' current lives, but we're also starting to learn a lot about their pasts. And I'm purposely being vague because I don't want to give anything away that would be a spoiler. A big part of why I enjoyed this book was learning about all of these truths that were being uncovered and having my impressions of certain characters panning out very differently from my initial impressions that I had on them. And I wouldn't want to take that away from any reader that is interested in picking up this book. This book was very rich in theme and it was extremely atmospheric. The setting of winter really added to those feelings of isolation and tension, and it contributed a hint of dread and doom along the way. Very early on as I started to read it, I knew that this book would be filled with way more sadness than joy. The bleakness in the backdrop of the setting also paired very well with the bleakness of circumstances that our characters were experiencing, and it also made the story feel very claustrophobic, which was perfect for the themes that were covered. I actually, after I read the book, I sat down and I kind of thought about, would this book have been as impactful if it was set in a different season? And I don't think that it would have been. Certainly not summer, maybe fall, because you start to have, the change in the seasons and it does start to get a little colder and things, but this storyline was perfectly set to happen during winter. One of the things that I took away from this book was the amount of guilt and shame that our characters felt. But there was also the other side of that coin where I felt as a reader that these characters should be feeling guilt and shame, and they didn't. So that to me really kept me on my toes with these characters, and it also made them very believable. They all had flaws and they all had admirable qualities, and even though I didn't agree with all of their decisions, the author did a great job of getting me to understand their motives, whether I agreed with them or not. Another thing that I really enjoyed about this book was the fact that each of our characters was carrying some type of trauma. They were carrying personal trauma, but there were also historical traumas that were covered as well. This book, as I mentioned, takes place in the early 1960s, and for our characters being so young, they're old enough to be young married couples, and if you're thinking about the 60s, if you go back to the childhoods of these characters, it would have been in the midst of World War II. So they were young enough to know that something was happening, but they may not have been old enough to experience the war in the way that their parents did or the adults in their lives did. And coming out of the war and being on the other side, even though they weren't as involved with it, there were still parts of that experience that lived with them today. And then not only did this book cover their personal traumas, but it also touched on the shared trauma that they have with their family and the individual trauma that their family members that were more active in the war were suffering. And I really think that that was a really interesting part of the book. They were not immune to memories or flashbacks, and they experienced the effects of trauma through their loved ones that experienced everything firsthand. And I think that the book did a really nice job of portraying that. All in all, even though this book was a bit of a downer, I really did enjoy my time spent with it. I thought it was well done. I thought the writing was great, and I thought that what the author seemed to be setting out to do was accomplished, and not only accomplished, but he did it well. I understand the merits of this book 100%, and I can see how it ended up on the long list and ultimately the short list. And I'm also really glad that I finally had a chance to pick up one of Miller's books. I have a couple of his books on my shelf that I've been meaning to get to for years, but never have. And now that I had the nudge to read this one, I'm looking forward to picking up some of those. The one I can think of off the top of my head that I know for sure I have is the Slow Worms song, and I'm pretty sure that that's about the Troubles, which is another period of history that I really like to read about, even though they tend to be very sad and miserable, but I like those types of books, so it definitely sounds something that would be right up my alley. I'm also curious to know if there are any other recommendations for Miller's books that you might have that you've read in the past and think would be worth a read. And as always, until we read again, bye!